Hello and welcome into the KE Report. I'm your host, Shad Markwitz, and today we're getting an update from Forum Energy Metals. Forum's traded on the TSX.V under the ticker FMC and on the OTCQB under the ticker FDCFF. And I'm joined today with the Vice President of Exploration for Forum Energy, Dr. Rebecca Hunter. And Rebecca, it's great to get you back on the show, really to encapsulate last year's drilling program in 2024. You put out three more results from the Ned, Ayra, and Loki targets at the Unconformity targets. We'll get into that in this call, but I think it would be nice for people that maybe haven't caught up with the company in a while or maybe missed the last prior calls just to encapsulate the whole program, what you did. And you've got a map that really shows a good image of the property. And this is at the Aberdeen Project in the Thelon Basin. And you'll see on there the two red stars, Tatiggaq and Qavvik. That was really the lion's share of the drilling from this year's program, was expanding that mineralization. There was some historic work done there at Cameco when you were there, but you expanded on that this year and learned a little bit more about both those basement hosted deposits. And you'll see three yellow stars on there. That's the Ned, Loki, and Ayra targets that we'll talk about later today, testing the different kind of mineralization, the unconformity targets. So I guess just as a good snapshot of what you did at Tatiggaq and Qavvik. Let's go through what you learned this year, Rebecca, the key takeaways for investors.
All right, thanks, Shad. Yeah, so I guess we can just start with the Tatiggaq and Qavvik, so the earlier part of what we released from our 2024 program. And so the main objectives, I guess just to go back quickly, there's kind of two main kind of targets that we have on this property. And so we have these basement hosted targets, as Shad said, so Tatiggaq and Qavvik are those type. And then about a third of our property is covered in sandstone. And so that's where we're looking for those kind of classic unconformity contact sort of deposits. And that's what the Ned, Loki, and Ayra targets were. But to start, we'll talk about our basement hosted stuff. And so we have historical mineralization, of course, at these two grids. And so basically in 2024, we wanted to get back to each of these, starting with Tatiggaq, and actually do more substantial drilling, do some infill, basically so that we could put a preliminary resource together, at least in-house for now, on the Tatiggaq area. And so we basically did 38 holes, Cameco did 38 holes, 19 holes this year. So did quite a bit of drilling at Tatiggaq. And so what we achieved is that we did that infill. We did some expansion. So we've expanded Tatiggaq West slightly. We understand the structural kind of complexity a bit better now on, kind of how these zones potentially kind of jog and kind of are offset. And so we can chase them better. And then we've outlined a new zone potentially to the north. So we got some elevated counts and really good alteration. So, I mean, the whole thing is altered because you have this huge gravity anomaly that's associated with the mineralization, but you have that more proximal alteration. And what I mean by that is the really strong clay, and I call it the sooty sulfide sort of stuff. These are the things that you look for that are very proximal to actual mineralization. So we're really encouraged by that. And so that's exciting that we could be chasing up another pod to the north here. And then a lot of the rest of this zone, again, I never got out to drilling the whole eastern half of this zone. So that's what we did for Tatiggaq in 2024. And then Qavvik, this was our first drill program, Forum's first drill program into Qavvik. We only had time for a couple holes, but we basically hit some really good mineralization. It exceeded the mineralization that I've drilled in the past. And so that was basically the biggest eye opener of the Qavvik drilling this summer, is that we actually got higher intercepts. And so that was really encouraging. So up to 8.2%, and very thick intercepts of mineralization. So a really extensive and nice basement system that's developing here. And there's a photo of kind of the higher grade here. This is the 8% up here in this core photo.
Well, and Rebecca, just remind us too, at Qavvik, you were drilling there the first time this year, but you've drilled it in the past with Cameco, and there were over 20 holes there, correct?
Yeah, so over 20 holes, kind of throughout the whole thing, fairly widely spaced, and steep holes. So again, similar to kind of Tatiggaq, these sort of basement systems are basically steep stacked lenses, essentially. So steep holes are kind of a bad way to drill and understand kind of where these are going. So basically the holes that we did this summer were a little bit more of an angle so that we could cut through more of them and understand the system a lot better.
Yeah, it came at more of a shallow angle than the steep angle. Learn a little bit more about it, and then even at Tatiggaq and Qavvik, these are deposits. You can call them that because there's so much information already historically, and so you're expanding the mineralization. Now, you did make the new discovery, that new zone at Tatiggaq, so that you could say that's a new discovery area. But a lot of people were confused and saying, "Hey, I'm just waiting for them to make a discovery." And I was talking with the CEO Rick Mazer about this. He said, "Discovery, we've already made the discovery. We're expanding these things." So, to your point you're making, you're also looking at wrapping some initial resources around this, and so these are not new areas; these are areas that you're expanding.
Exactly. So then there's a lot of room to expand, and I think that's the point. They're not delineated by any means. And at Qavvik in particular, there's a bunch of strike extent to the basically to the northeast and the south that's totally untested. That wasn't tested by myself during the Cameco days.
All right, well, now let's move into the new kids on the block, Ned, Ayra, and Loki. These are these unconformity targets where you're looking at where the sandstone meets the basement rock, and you're trying to find areas where there's uranium mineralization in both the sandstone and the basement. And you put out a press release that said that these were some pretty interesting data for you, and it's because it's in the sand as well as the basement. Walk us through that because when people saw highly elevated, they saw, well, this is not highly elevated, but from a geologist standpoint, explain why it is.
Yeah, so basically, these types of deposits, so this is the real strategy of form. So the Tatiggaq and Qavvik are kind of the sweeteners. There's mineralization. We're going to expand it. We're going to see what we got there. But the real potential here on form's property is actually finding that unconformity type contact deposit because those are the big ones in the Athabasca. And so that's the strategy here and why we're looking. And why basically 36 and 72 and even 4 ppm is actually elevated or exciting is that these are sandstone. So all these pictures here are actually of sandstone. And sandstone typically, so in the Thelon, so based on kind of work I've done in the past, kind of the median, which is the middle value statistically of um, sandstone uranium values is about zero point 0.8 to zero point 0.8 to 1 ppm. So basically anything over 1 ppm is where the sandstone is interesting. So it's elevated. And so even though these values are pretty small, like when you think about actual mineralization, 72 ppm uranium doesn't sound very high, but in the sandstone it is because the sandstone doesn't have uranium in it. Sandstone is basically quartz. And so it doesn't have, uranium minerals in it. So anyways, that's why this is exciting. And so essentially it's these values, not at Ned, but Ayra and Loki are an order of magnitude, well over an order of magnitude higher than what you get just in background sandstone. And so that's why it's exciting. And when you're an explorationist, that's a sort of subtle things that you look for to actually find deposits. And even Ned with 4 is 4 times higher than, what is background. So it's basically what I consider with Ned is that it's interesting, but it's not close. But what's super exciting about Loki and Ayra is that these types of values actually could be close to something much more significant.
Yeah, so you're vectoring in on these areas of interest and you're getting the smoke here and you're saying, okay, this is what we want to see. And we should also note that at the basement level, at Ira, you had 323 parts per million uranium. And then at another section, you had on hole 12, that was hole 11B. On hole 12, you had 260 parts per million uranium, again in the basement. So, in addition to the sandstone, you still had some good hits in the basement as well to accompany it. So, tell us about how that's vectoring in on one of these unconformity type deposits.
Yeah, well, what's encouraging about both of it, so you got these values, the 72 and the 36, they're basically at the unconformity. And then those other values are basically close to the unconformity in the basement. So you're right at that interface. And that's the interface where the big deposits happen in these types of systems. And so, and also those elevated uh, values in the basement are along fault zones. So again, you've got the fault zones happening, you've got significant alteration. So another part, even without, and I'm just going to go back to the sandstone for a second, but even without any thinking about the geochem in the sandstone, just the significant clay that's in this sandstone column is is really perspective. Like you don't see this sort of stuff unless there's something going on with these uranium systems.
Well, and you've got another slide here that compares the Thelon Basin to the Athabasca Basin. I think most people listening will be familiar with the Athabasca Basin. That's where the lion's share of these discoveries have been made. It really hasn't happened yet in the Thelon Basin, and your point forever has been that's because nobody's been looking for it. And so while you found the basement hosted mineralization, just like your neighbors at Orano have, the idea here, the dream here, is to find these kind of high grade really important discoveries, and I think it's a nice snapshot of the two basins. So walk us through the bigger term vision here.
Yeah, so I talk a lot about in that press release kind of this tier one and kind of system and what we're looking for. And Forum's greater strategy, of course, is we want to find a tier one deposit. And it's the tier one deposits that actually become mines in these systems so far. And so it's almost a game of numbers here, so or probabilities. And so basically this is kind of a snapshot in the Athabasca, kind of those main deposits. So I've kind of broken them up into super tier one, and tier two deposits in the different colors here. So green is the tier two, orange is the tier one, and then of course the super tier one. And so that encompasses about 16 major deposits, not all of which are mines, but some have been mined and some are currently being mined. But that's the kind of numbers you're looking at. So basically, I classify the tier two deposits as over 50 million pounds and the tier one deposits over 100 million pounds. And those super tier one, of course, are these really big deposits with also very significant grade. Um, and that's the big investment opportunity for Forum is that we've got the same kind of basin. We got the same, obviously the same system in the Thelon. We've got uranium mineralization significant. So, you know, the Orano deposit in as a whole, the Qavvik project has over 100 million pounds. The highest grade or the largest deposit rather is Andrew Lake, and that's about 60 million pounds. So it's a solid tier two deposit. That's the current major discovery in the Thelon Basin. And so essentially, it's just a game of numbers. We have the same geology, we have the right structures, we have the mineralization systems. And so it's just a matter of time until we find it. And so just having the strategy and having the funding to basically explore these really good trends, there has to be basically significant deposits to find in the Thelon Basin as well.
And that's why it was so significant seeing those elevated levels in the sand, because it's like, hey, you're on the right track. The thesis is proving out. So for people that maybe didn't understand that, hopefully we put a little color around that. And we should also remind people that Forum Energy has 9 properties in the Athabasca Basin. I mean, you're just getting ready to start drilling just next month at the Northwest Athabasca Basin, the JV project. So you've got 9 different shots, cracks at the pinata in the Athabasca Basin. Some of those are JV, with other companies. Some of those are 100% owned. So you've got a nice footprint of projects in the Athabasca Basin, but then in the Thelon Basin, still testing this thesis for the big prize as well as the known mineralization that's there. Can you tell us, just as we wrap up, Rebecca, what the follow-up drilling will look like in the Thelon Basin for 2025?
Yeah, well, the big strategy is that basically we want to find a tier one deposit. And so we're going to be testing. We have basically over 50 kind of targets, like really good. And in the Thelon Basin, like I've said before, one of the really good targeting methods is using gravity. So basically all the Qavvik deposits and all the showings are associated with these gravity lows. And so we have over 50 of them on our property. We have a fairly large property. And so we are going to basically go to the testing of looking at as many as we can and kind of see if we can actually sleuth out a tier one or a significant system within our property. And the focus is going to be where we have the sandstone as well, because if you look at any of the majority of the deposits that are tier one in the Athabasca Basin are ones that have the mineralization at that contact. And so that's going to be our focus in 2025.
And then because you saw what you liked at Ayra and Loki, will there be some holes going back into those targets?
For sure, yes. So Loki and Ayra. And so I mean, just the fact that we have that significant uranium in the sandstone basically indicates that we could be close to something at both those grids. And so going back there, and then I have a number of targets in the northern part of the property in the sandstone, again, that are along kind of subsidiary fault zones. So these east-northeast fault zones are kind of the main kind of corridors that look to host the mineralization. So we have more of that in the northern part of our property, and I'll be following up those in a big way.
All right, so it's going to be exciting to see the thesis come together in the Thelon Basin and keep pressing your bets there, as well as still building the mineralization at Tatiggaq and Qavvik. And we're going to be turning our focus in future interviews to the Northwest Athabasca project, as you're the operators there, and you'll be getting those drills turning just here in a couple weeks. Rebecca, it's always great having you on the show and getting an update on Forum Energy. And for those listening in, if you want to get more information or follow the news as it's released, definitely click on the link below this interview. It takes you out to the Forum Energy website, straight to their news section where you can sign up for updates or just follow along as the news hits the wires. And looking forward, as always, to our next conversation.
Thanks a lot, Shad.